Join your host, Maddie Roche, as she brings you into a community of fee-only financial advisors who are successfully building profitable businesses that serve the next generation of clients. Learn from innovative advisors whose unique stories will inspire you to dream big and take action on your goals. Are you ready to live your best life and help your clients live theirs? Then you're in the right place.
Hello, and welcome to XYPN Radio. I'm Maddie Roche, your host. I'm honored to have Cindu Thomas-George, a professor and owner of Shakthi Diversity and Equity Training, on the show with me today. I met Cindu last year when she shared just some of her lifetime of experience and expertise with Team XYPN during a 6-part training. Today, Cindu is on the show to discuss the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to lay out a persuasive business case for DEI initiatives as a growth strategy within a business. She discusses the concepts of power and social capital and highlights the moral case for considering these concepts within your own work. She answers the tough questions like, is this conversation a political one? And what can advisors do when something tragic happens? But what I loved most about this conversation with Cindu was how it really demonstrates the power of the work that you all are doing as financial advisors by bringing financial planning and literacy to communities and to people who have not had access to it before. If you weren't convinced that financial planning is an impactful, helping profession, Cindu confirms it is. If you're interested in learning about how the ideas of DEI can impact your business for the better, then this interview is for you. Avocado toast, selfies, a mountain of student loan debt. Gen Y is anything but traditional, and with over 75 million people, it's a population you don't want to ignore. Learn more about how to serve this unique population in our guide called Attract and Profitably Serve Millennial Clients in Your RIA. Discover 3 key ways to tap into the millennial market and 6 things that they want from their financial advisor. Visit xyplanningnetwork.com/millennials for your free copy. You can find any of the resources we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/306. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN Radio listeners. It's the community of advisors we've all been looking for. That's there to provide support when we need it the most. Best of all, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. Again, that's xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here's my interview with Cindu. Good morning, Cindu. Welcome to XYPN Radio. How are you?
I'm good. I'm well. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. I know our listeners are also looking forward to this conversation. So, Cindu, why don't you do the honors and go ahead and introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. So I'm a Chicago-based DEI practitioner. I have a boutique diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm, and I work with organizations across different industries to help cultivate an inclusive and equitable and anti-racist, workplace culture. And I'm also a full-time tenured professor of communication studies at the College Lake County, specialized in both public speaking and intercultural communication. And in addition to teaching at my college, I founded a DEI training program for faculty and staff that I've been doing for over a decade. So that's a little bit on the professional side. I also am doing a lot of work, volunteer work. I sit on boards. So a lot of my work around anti-racism and inclusion, it's not just professional, it's also personal. And so, on a more personal note, I'm a wife, I'm a mom of 2 young boys, and I'm the daughter of Indian immigrants. And my parents immigrated here to the US from India in the early 70s. And I was raised in a predominantly white suburb outside of Chicago. And we were the only family of color and one of the only immigrant families. And due to that, I experienced a lot of unfortunate racism and xenophobia from a really early age of 5 in kindergarten. And it was these experiences and the experiences that I had being a young woman of color teaching in higher ed that kind of drew me to the work that I do today. So I share that with you because I speak about these topics, not just from a conceptual or a theoretical place, but really from a personal one.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cindu, I'm familiar with your work because XYPN had you join us for a 6-part, 3-day diversity, equity, and inclusion training a few months ago that my colleagues have, and I agree, thought that it was the best training we've ever been to in terms of learning really tangible, practical tips on how to navigate really what is becoming incredibly important and relevant topic in the workplace. And Cindu, I'd love to know, thanks for sharing kind of the personal side of things, but what got you into this work? And was it something you always kind of knew you would be doing?
Yeah, when I was an undergrad, my dream was to be a professor. I just wanted to be a professor because the classes that I took really transformed my life, right? And really the theory to action, just being able to apply what I was learning to my own life and help me understand my own life. I wanted to be able to do that for other people like myself. So that's kind of what got me into the teaching and studying intercultural communication, which is part of the DEI world. It's more the skills building workshops that you'll take. And then when I got into my graduate program, I saw the need for this kind of awareness to be not just in the classroom where it takes, a student 5-6 years to be able to apply it in the workplace, but actually in the workplace. And so then my other goal was to be a DI practitioner. And so what got me in was just kind of a taste of that in graduate school. And I really just wanted to create social change and social impact and do it in a way that was more immediate than in the classroom. And I don't want to give up the classroom learning. And so that's kind of why I do both simultaneously.
Beautiful. And how long have you had Shakthi training under you?
Yeah, so I've been teaching in higher ed for 17 years, and I would say consistently I've been doing Shakthi for 15. So just about 2 years after I started teaching. Yeah, I've been doing them simultaneously, but I would say in the last probably 9 years after my oldest turned 1, I really started to pursue it more seriously and took it more of this is a business. And, it takes up much more of my time than it did the first 7 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know you're familiar with Team XYPN, and I know we've talked a lot about kind of the advisors that make up our community, the financial planners who are doing really important work. I'm interested in kind of your perspective of the financial industry and how diversity, equity, inclusion training, or just the topic of it, is kind of fitting into that industry.
Yeah. So, well, one, I think it's important to just acknowledge that this industry has blown up. The DEI world and space has really blown up in the last 5 years, but specifically after the murder of George Floyd, right? Mm. And the reality is that DEI should be a part of every industry. It affects every part of our society, including the finance industry. But traditionally, finance industry is a white male dominated industry, right? Just like so many other industries that exist in business. So I think that it fits in. There is a place for it. There's always been, but right now organizations are realizing, okay, we need to have this conversation. So I think it definitely has a place. And I think XYPN in general, your whole business model is to make wealth management accessible to people who historically have not had this service, right? So financial literacy is something that a lot of young folks don't think about. They tend to be excluded from the wealth management space. Also, Black, Indigenous people of color don't typically learn wealth management from their families. And this works to really maintain the growing wealth gap in our country. So by nature, XYPN, just by design, is inclusive and is part of DEI. I think you're working indirectly and directly to fight economic injustice. And so many people can learn, so many organizations can learn from your model.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the beautiful things about XYPN advisors is that we really are widening the scope of service and support financially to different populations, especially those that have been underserved. How do you see kind of that access to building wealth as being maybe a catalyst for change in terms of racism and classism?
Yeah. So, I'll start by just saying that typically communities of color, they don't have the social capital in terms of how to build wealth, right? So, for example, myself, I'm an immigrant, daughter of an immigrant. My parents taught me how to always pay off my credit card bills, right? Work hard, but they didn't tell me how to necessarily grow my wealth, right? So that's not something that we inherit. And a lot of times wealth is inherited generationally. So if you look at like the average median household income, Asian families have the most, but if you look at just the general wealth, white families by far have the most wealth, right? Because it's accumulated over generation and generation. And so classism now brings me to classism and racism. So that's kind of the more looking at immigrant families and why, we need to be taught this and we need to have access to wealth management so that we can disrupt the wage gap. But then there's also a really big relationship, an intersection around racism and classism. So the system of racism created policies and procedures and laws that systemically disadvantage Black, Indigenous people of color. And this system was really engineered into the foundation of our country, and it goes back more than 400 years, right? So, for example, in this country, racist policies have worked to disadvantage Black Americans while advantaging white Americans simultaneously. I'll just give you a small example, and I'll go back to your question because I think it's really important to have concrete examples. So Black people were historically prevented from building wealth by slavery. Black people were forced into chattel slavery, in which they were bought and sold and born into slavery. And it was also against the law to do things like teach an enslaved person to read and write, because that would help them with upward mobility. Then we had Jim Crow laws, which was 100 years of segregation, separate but equal. Don't let that fool you, because there was nothing equal about Black Americans at that time. And, then within that time, there were specific government sanctioned policies that helped, to widen the wealth gap. So in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, otherwise known as the FHA, created loan programs to help make homeownership accessible to more Americans. So the government created color-coded maps, green for good neighborhoods, red for bad neighborhoods, to determine who got those loans. So many neighborhoods were designated as red because Black people and other people of color lived in them, and those neighborhoods didn't get the funding, right? So this process is known as redlining, which systemically prevented them from not only getting home loans, but also encouraged developers in green areas to explicitly discriminate against people of color. Stay with me. I know you might be lost, but this is all racism, right? So to give you a better idea, between 1934 and 1962, 98.6% of the $120 billion available for loans from the FHA went to white people. So what's 98.6 rounded up, Maddie?
99%.
Yeah, 99% of the $120 billion available for loans from 1934 to 1962 went to white people. So now let's look at the intersections of racism and classism to help us understand how this example of racism, the systemic racism and inequality, impacts the wealth gap and classism. We have to consider the inability for families of color to get loans impacted their ability to buy homes, right, at the same rate as other Americans. Homeownership is considered the most significant route to family and personal wealth building in the 20th century. So something like homeownership has a really clear and direct relationship to disparity in median wealth of white and Black households. So the wealth gap was created because of the government policies that meant that families of color were not able to give young members of their family finances and support for their future. And because of that, they were less likely to attend college. And because of that, they were paid less. And in many cases, they raised their children in similar socioeconomic statuses. So wealth is really meant to be security. And wealth is something created not just solely by people themselves, it's accumulated over generations. And so I think that this can give you an idea of how racism impacts classism.
Wow. Every time you speak, Cindu, I'm taking notes. I'm always so captivated with your deep understanding of this. And I speak on behalf of a lot of our advisors when we say that it's an uphill battle to get people to understand the value of financial planning, the importance it could play long-term in people's financial security long-term, let alone discussing this with folks that have never really had access to financial planning before. Any thoughts on kind of that? It goes back to that idea that, at some points we weren't even teaching people about this, and now we are trying to teach people about this. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think financial literacy is something that's so important. And, it's documented that many Americans don't have that literacy. And so there is a real need for all of us, including people in my own community. And just, for example, Indian households are the wealthiest households in America in terms of median household income. And they're the most educated. But for sure, they are not investing in their future and their wealth management the way that communities who have been here for generations are, right? And so think about how much you can do if you're growing the wealth that you have today. But a lot of us, just because we don't know any better, just let it sit in the bank, right? And so I think that there is a need for financial literacy, which is really what your organization does. It provides access and resources and support for wealth management so that we can learn how to grow the money that we have, to kind of even out the playing field and disrupt some of the economic injustice that happens. I think think maybe one of the things that some advice for you or even the advisors who are working with clients directly is just inform yourself on statistics, right? Inform yourself on the history of classism and racism and the intersections. In 2019, the median white household, it was 188,000 approximately in wealth. And that's 7.8 times more than the typical Black household, which is only 24,000. So the racial wealth gap exists, and between white and Black, and also white and Latinx, this is really about the same as it was in the 1950s. So we're making very little progress in reducing incomes and wealth inequalities in the last 70 years. And a lot of that is because we are not equipping people with the knowledge, the tools, and the skills to help with their management.
Absolutely. You've made a great case for why the work that our listeners and advisors in our community do is valuable. But I'm really interested in your perspective, Cindu, in terms of how, as business owners, they think and consider DEI in their space. Yes, they're able to hopefully provide access to and financial literacy to underrepresented community members. But how do they think about it as a business owner in terms of how do they incorporate and kind of live the way, or I guess, walk the walk that they're talking?
Yeah. Well, I think first, you have to never talk and not walk, right? And understand the business case for DEI. So I recommend that, small business owners and, your advisors really make DEI part of the DNA of their work and of their organization. Think of it as a growth strategy, right? And I think that they have a great model, which is XYPN, to base off of, right? You guys are doing so much work to walk your talk. And if you don't know what that means, just look at Alan's, LinkedIn posts, or Ryan's LinkedIn posts, or the posts that you share on social media from your organization. Everything from, being transparent in pay, right, to walking your talk, to, the CEO has to be the chief diversity officer. So these are all things that are important, and you have a good role model in XYPN. But going back to the business case, there's been so much research over the last decade that shows that organizations that work to make their workplaces diverse and inclusive are just more successful when compared to the peers that are not. So they're more innovative, they're smarter, and they also are more profitable, right? And this is especially true when the diversity of employees lies within the leadership of an organization. So, inclusion of diverse individuals can really be a differentiator amongst companies. And so if you have a team of two, that might not really apply, right? But diversity is really a growth strategy. If you employ a lot of people, you want to make sure that they can bring their whole authentic selves to the workplace, so that they feel a sense of belonging and they can thrive. You also, I think it's good to show representation for the increasingly diverse clientele that you have, right? About 1 million immigrants come to this country a year, right? And so over time, the majority of Americans, when all clumped together, all racial groups are going to be the majority. And so if you aren't using DEI as part of your growth strategy, you're going to be losing, in the end. I'll just give you one example. I know that because I did training with you guys, I did a lot of research, and there's a lack of Spanish speaking wealth management advisors. And that's just a fact. And that's a lost business opportunity, because when it comes to Spanish-speaking individuals, let's just consider Latino people in general, they account for 60 million Americans, or 18.5% of the population, and they're going to be growing drastically. So by 2050, 1 in every 4 Americans is going to be Hispanic, and this community has a lot of buying power, and it would be such a shame not to appeal to this large growing demographic, right? And so that's important to just kind of get your heads wrapped around. Is there's potential monetization, but you don't want to get stuck in the business case. You also want to think about the moral case, right? And what representation does. And so if you're appealing to communities of color or low income communities that don't necessarily get that service, you're creating representation for them and you're unlocking potential. And so that kind of speaks a little bit to the moral case.
Love that. I'm interested in, how do you, Cindu, define diversity?
So diversity is really about numerical representation, right? Who's in the room, in who's represented. And we are obsessed as a country with diversity reporting, whether it be through the census or different industries. How many women do we have? How many people of color do we have? How many people identify as LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really about, what diversity is. And diversity creates representation, right? And that's important. But if you have a diverse organization and you stop at your diversity, and that is where you end your diversity and inclusion initiatives, that can be creating a toxic environment for historically underrepresented people. You need to be inclusive, right? And so is your second question, what is inclusion?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, inclusion is really creating an environment where everybody can thrive, right? Creating an environment in which all people feel welcome, feel a sense of belonging to show up as their true, authentic self, in which all individuals feel that they can provide their input, right? And so that, I don't have the definition right off the top of my head, but in a diverse environment doesn't guarantee that it's inclusive, right? So just because you have numbers, don't pat yourself on the back. You should be asking your employees and your clients, do you feel included, right? Are you being inclusive? And inclusion is an intentional action. So very two different things.
I hope all of our listeners have a notepad out because I am also taking notes. And can you talk a bit about equity and what that really means?
Yeah. So Equity is really important, and equity should be the center of diversity and inclusion initiatives. And I think in order to understand equity, you have to talk about equality, right? So we as a society, we like to throw around equality and equity a lot. A lot of people confuse them for each other, but equality is treating everybody the same. And equality sometimes doesn't get you anywhere because we have a country that is rid with systemic inequalities and systemic discrimination that has created these inequalities. And equity isn't just treating everyone the same, it's giving people what they need in order to be successful. And sometimes that means giving people who have been disadvantaged and disenfranchised more, and giving those who have been advantaged and privileged less in order to even out the playing field. So equity is really a redistribution of access and resources.
Yeah, great answer. Obviously, last summer kind of created a racial reckoning, to use your words, among a lot of Americans. I think it was long overdue. I think we both agree on that. But I'm interested, what do you see and how do you see different industries responding to it? And is it too late?
Yeah. I don't think it's ever too late. There are so many organizations and industries that are responding differently. One route is, I'm not going to talk about it. It's not my place. I don't want to be political. And the other route, which is a more popular route I see, is, yes, let's put out a statement. So there are both kind of responses. But, I think one of the things that we have to be really careful about is not to be performative, right? So some organizations are saying, hey, we stand with Black lives, or, we stand against anti-Asian hate, because now as a result of COVID, we're also seeing a drastic resurgence of anti-Asian hate that's terrorizing communities of color, Asian communities. And so you don't want to be performative. If you're going to say something, you need to make sure that you're accountable and do something about it as well. So I think there's a lot of organizations that are performative and they're being called out, but I do think it is never too late, right, to speak out. It's really important to use your voice. If you feel that, injustices in society are important to address, then use your voice. Martin Luther King said that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. That's a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. And it's a quote that I live by, right? And so if you really believe that it's important, even if it has nothing to do with your business, you should speak out about it, because guess what? Your clients, your communities, your employees, they might be affected by this, right? And it matters to them. And so if they see you take a stance, they're going to feel included. They're going to feel present. They're going to feel heard, right?
I am interested in this idea that this is all political and we can't possibly get involved because this is a political thing. How do you view diversity, equity, and inclusion in that argument?
So, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that the political is personal for most, right? And if you don't understand that, then I think it's safe to say that you come from a place of privilege or you just live in a bubble. And privilege is oftentimes not how we've been advantaged in our lives, but oftentimes it's about the challenges and the disadvantages that other people have had to experience that we haven't ourselves, right? So, when you talk about privilege, people get like upset or very defensive. Everybody has privilege. I know, Maddie, we went through a training together where we had to literally sit down and think about what our unearned privilege is. And the reality is simultaneously we have privileges, identities, and also identities that are not privileged. But if you don't think that talking about racism or classism or diversity and inclusion is appropriate in the workplace, you have to realize that these issues are affecting humans, right? And humans live and work in the workplace. And so it is something that is coming into our workplaces, even though it might not directly be tied to your business. It's an important issue. And I think that anti-racism and inclusion and equity affect all aspects of society. And so I would say that if you say that it's political, to think about it and also to check your privilege.
Yeah, that privilege activity that you had us go through was one of the most eye-opening I'd ever walked through. Would you mind kind of talking the listeners through maybe a 2-minute privilege check for themselves?
I think it's hard to kind of do this without going into teacher mode, but I would say, there's a lot of resources online, but just to think about your ordinary privilege, when you walk into a restaurant, a privilege is able-bodied privilege, right? I have all of my ability to move. I have nothing broken. I don't have a disability. So I'm able to navigate walking into a restaurant, sitting at that seat and eating without thinking about it, right? That's ordinary privilege. Now, what if, you had a disability, or what if you were bound to a wheelchair? How would you be able to move through and just do that ordinary activity? Those are things that we don't oftentimes think. So I think that thinking about your own identities and how you have been benefited and advantaged just because of the way that you show up, right? So, and I think it's harder to do it, in 2 minutes. I can't really talk about that, but I think it's important for everyone to acknowledge their privileges and think about how their identities influence the way they live their lives, right? How they show up in the world, even in the workplace. And how is that different than people who don't share the same identities as you? And you can look at things like race and gender and sex and sexual orientation and all of those things.
Yeah. Well said. I'm always really interested in seeing people's response to this conversation. It's eye-opening. And I must say that the privilege check is something where I see people really have a hard time with. It's hard to acknowledge your privilege. And even if you do, to take the attitude that maybe it has benefited you is something that a lot of people struggle digesting. What's your experience on coaching around that?
I've had a wide range. I think, in the early 2000s when I was doing this work, there was a much more visceral reaction. The term white privilege was not being used by Anderson Cooper on CNN. And I think in 2013, after Trayvon Martin was murdered, we started having this national conversation. And so there is much more of a consciousness. There's less resistance, but I will always get somebody who stays after a training who private messages me or emails me saying, "You're being divisive. I don't like this conversation." And that's really the fragility in us, right? Nobody wants to think about how we've been benefiting our whole life for no other reason besides just the way that we were born. And from our benefiting, somebody else is not being benefited. They're being disadvantaged. So I would say the response is really different depending on who you talk to. Typically, you're going to get the more resistance from white men, because our society values white males, right? We have gender supremacy where we've always valued men. And if you don't believe me, just look back in history. Women weren't able to vote. They weren't able to go to college. They weren't able to run a marathon. They weren't able to apply for a credit card. That changed in the 70s. And then you have white supremacy, right? And I know that's kind of controversial to say, but after George Floyd died, the term white supremacy is also normalized in our society. And what does that mean? That doesn't mean that there's people walking around with white hoods everywhere. I uphold the system of white supremacy. It's a culture that really values white identity, and the idea that white is right is really part of that. And so those two things are obvious, privileges that we have. And so I think white males really feel very attacked, right? And the point of talking about privilege is not to blame, shame, or guilt people. Right. It's for people to kind of see that invisibility of privilege that exists around us. And people of color also are privileged. If you're, as an Indian woman, I've experienced so much oppression, so much racism, so much sexism, but simultaneously, I've experienced so much privilege at the same time. So it's always important to remember that most people simultaneously have both privileged and non-privileged identities.
Mm. Yeah, a really, really wonderful activity to think through. I'm interested, Cindu, when we're talking directly to our listeners who are business owners or thinking about becoming business owners, what is the appropriate action to take when something tragic happens?
I don't know if there's an appropriate or a right or a wrong, but, if something like the George Floyd murder happens, I would say the appropriate action is not to be silent, right? Because when you're neutral or silent in, times of injustice and you're taking the side of the oppressor, I didn't create that quote, that's by Desmond Tutu, but it's a famous quote and it means a lot, so think about if there is a future tragedy that is race-based or any kind of tragedy, and there will be, because that's just the nature of our society. Consider thinking about how you can, address it and not be silent, because you addressing it means you're taking a stance and you're becoming uncomfortable, and it means that you care, right? And when you do address it, make sure you don't just talk, make sure you walk, right? And if you need to have blueprints or frameworks, look at what other organizations are doing, including XYPN, right? So you don't have to kind of invent everything and invent language. You can look at what other people are doing and make sure that when you are making a statement, it's authentic. If you don't think it's important, then don't, right? Don't get in the game unless you're authentic, because you'll get called out.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm interested in this idea of color blindness, kind of related to our last line of questions, but how do you address kind of this idea? Well, no, I'm colorblind and I've been taught to be colorblind. Is that the right thing to be?
I would say it is harmful to race relations. It is unproductive to building a racially just society. It's really easy to say, I don't see color, right? It's a convenient thing to say, because then we don't have to talk about racism if you don't see color. But the reality is that we can see color. Unless you literally have a physical ailment where you cannot see color, you can see color. I mean, we're looking at each other right now. You're a white woman and you're never going to not be a white woman to me. And you're never going to say, well, Cindu might be Polish, right? Because what's above the surface matters, right? So, I think color blindness is problematic, and I would encourage everyone to move past that towards color consciousness. And I talk a lot about that. I have a video about color blindness on my YouTube channel that you can look at. But I do think that it's harmful. And all color blindness does is it allows the system of racism to thrive. And so if you care about disrupting racism and you want to be racially inclusive, you should never have the approach of, we're just human, we all bleed red. We shouldn't have to see color, but the reality is we do, right? Because your skin color matters. And this past year, out of any year of my life, I think Americans are waking up to the idea that there are racial inequalities that exist.
Yeah. Could you explain a little bit more about color consciousness and how to employ that in terms of behavior for individuals?
Yeah, so color consciousness is the idea where you recognize and acknowledge the racial and cultural differences, because color is not just, when we say colorblind, I think people just automatically assume like, okay, there's black, there's white, there's brown, but really what's at the heart of color blindness is that you're ignoring someone's culture, right? And so I'll talk about color consciousness in a second, but for example, for me, I've heard so many people say, oh, Cindu, we're the same, you're just just like me. And even colleagues have said that to me. And well, my response is, no, we're not the same. We might both be women, but we're not a monolith, as a gender. And my experiences of being a professor in higher education have really different than yours. Let me tell you, and so when you say you don't see, me as any different than you, then you're just kind of erasing some of the oppressive experiences. You're also erasing some really important parts of who I am, the way that I eat, how I value, my elders and the respect that I give, the traditions and the cultural, practices that I employ daily, my language that I use at home. All of those things are central to my identity. And so when you say you don't see my Indianness, you're saying you don't see me, right? So color consciousness is being able to acknowledge, okay, Cindu is an Indian woman. She's a daughter of immigrants. And that might matter in the way that she experiences the world, right? So I think color consciousness is just not being afraid to acknowledge the differences. And that can really help to create an inclusive society, right?
Yeah. Are these conversations that you encourage people to have, that as we meet people who are different than us, to ask about their experience being a Black woman, being an Indian woman? Is that appropriate to begin conversation around?
I would say when you build trust with somebody, then you can start, learning, but you don't want to just go up to random people that you don't know or people that you don't have a relationship with, right? That's problematic in itself. And that's emotionally taxing to let me tell you about all of my experiences. I'm a practitioner, and I just wrote about a racist event that happened 12 years ago. And it took me 5 years to write it because it was painful, right? And so it's not like a fun thing to talk about, but it's important. So I would say when you have a relationship with the person, to start, learning about their experiences, that might be appropriate. But if you just have a coworker that you say hi and bye to, that would not be appropriate.
Yeah. I'm interested in how this all kind of relates to this concept of power, which was another thing you spoke a lot about to our group. And I'm interested, how does, this conversation around race really relate to the feelings and dynamics of power? As people enter in rooms and restaurants and things like that.
Yeah, so power is always present in communication. It's like the rule of power. And that's why it's always important to kind of think about power dynamics, right? And so, I'm a teacher. So when I go into the room, there's this maybe more obvious power of teacher-student. But when you go into an organization, there are also power dynamics. When you're in society, there are also power dynamics. So you want to think about how power is always present, and it impacts our society. So the people in power are the ones that control, our society, how we communicate, how we behave, what we value. For example, I'll talk about a non-race one, and that's Christianity. The Christian religion is a religion of power in the society. The majority of Americans are Christian. And so because of that, we see that we have Christmas is, not just for Christians, but everyone celebrates Christmas. Almost everything is closed on Christmas. Maybe there's a Chinese restaurant in your neighborhood that's not. Easter, and we just had Easter last weekend, and so that is something that we even say Happy Easter to people who aren't Christian, right? Because and we have the Easter bunny, and so I don't have to get asked to be off on those holidays. I am always off on those holidays, right? Because the people in power have tended to be Christian. And so that is something that we observe and acknowledge. And I benefit from that being Catholic myself, right? Whereas, the majority of Indians are Hindu. And so I know lots of Hindu people, they don't get their celebrations and their days off, right? They have to ask for it. Oftentimes they don't get it. And it's not celebrated as widespread. And so power matters. And I think that a lot of the strife that we're seeing now is a fear of losing power, especially with racial, in terms of racial justice. People are against, policies and practices that are working towards creating racial inclusivity, because they're afraid that, if a brown or Black person is being advantaged, then that simultaneously means that as a white person, they're being disadvantaged. But it's not a zero-sum game, right? Just because one community is doing well doesn't mean that another community has to be left behind.
Right. Absolutely. When we think about small business owners, what do you think in terms of how to move the needle forward? I think 2020 was a year for a lot of folks to do some personal theorizing about themselves. And a lot of us have chewed on the questions that we've talked about today. But in terms of the day-to-day of a business owner, I mean, how can you make an impact and move the needle forward?
Yeah, so I would say, one, inclusion is intentional. I have a whole hour that I could talk about inclusion in itself, but there are so many practices that you can, employ to be inclusive. There are organizational practices or, personal practices. And so be intentional in cultivating inclusion. And then also center equity in your diversity initiatives. One thing that I always encourage clients to do is when you're creating a policy or a program or even a business, ask yourself who is being advantaged from this business or from this action or from this policy, and who's being disadvantaged. And if you always ask yourself that when you make big decisions, you can be sure that you're working towards being an inclusive leader, an inclusive manager, inclusive employer.
Beautiful, beautiful. Cindu, I'm wondering about this idea of money. Our advisors are in the business of money and helping people with money. Do you have any direct maybe advice about how to talk about money with people who are different than us? Is there things that we should watch out for? You gave us a great presentation about just the power of language and kind of creating inclusive language, but around the idea of money, I mean, are there missteps that people could take that could find them in hot water, or any advice on how to broach the topic of that?
I would say that realize that, language is used differently in different communities. And especially when you're working with minoritized populations that don't have financial literacy, they might not know just the basic terminology. And this may or may not be related, but because I'm in education, when we talk to families, first generation, I'm a first generation college student. So I remember my parents didn't know what credit meant, right? You'll get 3 credits. In their mind, they're thinking, oh crap, they want my credit score. And that's a hindrance to continuing college, right? And so it similarly, do your clients that are new to this industry, new to this world, do they have the language? So create shared language, right? Maybe there's a kind of a sheet that you create that say, here are some terminology that you want to know if you want to be successful at wealth management, right? Because we don't have that. That's called social capital, where we pick things up from the generation before us. Well, if we just came to this country and our parents came here without knowing the language and the culture, then they're not going to know these terms, right? And so help people and help empower them by creating knowledge and skills and tools for them to succeed in that.
Oh, I love that idea of social capital, just the heaviness of that I think it's bigger than I ever thought it was. Would you explain a little bit more about social capital?
Yeah, so social capital is the idea that, we have networks already put into place to help us succeed in our lives. And it was originated in higher education to help first generation college students and help teachers explain that, hey, not all of your students have these ideas. They don't have the language. And so sometimes we need to be explicit, right? And so the example of like credit hour, it's really sitting there and teaching them that. It's helping them with networking, helping to advance them so that they can navigate higher education and be successful. And they don't have parents at home or communities telling them what to do. And so that's kind of what social capital is helping, being intentional in building that. And so when you are working with people who are immigrants, second generation immigrants, even in wealth management, they don't have that capital, they don't have that knowledge and that awareness. Social capital means explicitly working to build that, right? So it looks different in your industry, but social capital is important to equip people with so that they can succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. My mind is going to how can we create, XY Planning Network as a network for a reason, and the power that can have in terms of introducing folks to each other and cultivating a community of advisors that's diverse and inclusive, hopefully, and equitable.
I'm smiling because you don't realize it, but I realize that you are a social capital. I mean, your whole business is equipping people with social capital, which is why I'm so jazzed to work with you, as an organization, because it just is so amazing to see that, a company that is profitable is also working to do good. So
yeah, I so appreciate that. It's been a real journey, and it's something that leadership at XYPN has been committed to really since day one. And it's only been, over the past couple of years that we've had the resources to really start building the company the way that we want. And this idea that hopefully we're creating a place that long-term can allow advisors to build their own businesses, because we know that once you create your own wealth, you can pass it on from generation to generation. That, XYPN's play in this game may be long-term versus short-term, but we surely hope that by empowering advisors to go out and be entrepreneurs, that they can build wealth for themselves. And any thoughts around that in terms of kind of the power of being an entrepreneur in this world?
Yeah. I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own business, and I learned it from my father. It's really kind of in my family. And I think there's a lot of power for working for yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Having that independence, creating the rules, creating the culture that you want to create, and also building a legacy for your family, right? For your children and your grandchildren. And I think it's a great thing. And I think a lot of, if you're targeting young folks, if your target audience is, Black, Indigenous, people of color, we'll be a lot of times the first people in our family to be entrepreneurs. And so you can really kind of have a trickle down effect by that. When you are an entrepreneur and you go through the things and you learn the lessons that you do, you can share that with your community. So I think there's a lot of beauty. I mean, I love being an entrepreneur, and it's a great feeling, and it's rewarding.
Yeah. And as I think about that, there's legs up that folks have because of their privilege and power going into being an entrepreneur that a lot of us may take for granted, that it's a lot easier for advisors to go out and start businesses when, several of your parents and grandparents were business owners and they've passed off some support to you. This idea of social capital continues to kind of sit in my brain, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah. Cindu, I could literally talk to you all day long, and I want to talk to you all day long. Unfortunately, we are rounding out our podcast. I'm wondering, Cindu, where can advisors go and learn more? I mean, as we've heard over and over again, that it's the time that folks do begin to educate themselves and not necessarily rely on their teammates of color to give them updates on how to be human. But where can advisors go and learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think there's so much out there now more than ever. And so, you can follow people on Instagram. I'm on Instagram at Shakthi, Diversity and Equity. LinkedIn, I actually learned so much from LinkedIn. There are people that are really kind of thought leaders on DEI, and their job is to just post and create information. So Lily Zheng, Zheng is one of them that I recommend. Janice Gassam, she's a Black American that I'm personally friends with, and she's brilliant. She has a couple of books out about, anti-racism in the workplace. Verna Myers, who is the VP of Inclusion at Netflix, is also somebody that I really look up to. And Eddie Moore Jr. Is another person. And then read books. I'll just, recommend two out of the hundreds that I read and love. But Pamela Newkirk, who's a Black American professor and consultant, she wrote the book Diversity, Inc. And then Dolly Shug, she's an Indian woman in New York as well, and she wrote The Person You Meant to Be. And it's a great book about bias, and she makes academic research really accessible. And if you really want to know how to disrupt bias and how to be an inclusive leader, I would recommend that. And then lastly, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, which is the bestseller that you've probably already heard about. But yeah, so there's so much you can learn from out there on the interwebs and even on social media. And it's sometimes free, but if you are finding yourself kind of consuming a lot of information and that person has a Patreon, pay them for their knowledge, because, that's labor that they put in, an investment that they put in to get the expertise that they have.
Totally. And like anything, when you learn more, you change as a human, and we bring that education into how we show up every day, and committing to some level of education around this. And just this conversation is so eye-opening. There's so many different roads to go down. I really encourage it among our listeners, and I hope that this conversation was fruitful. And if you have other questions, please bring them to the VIP group, or shoot me an email. Always, I'd be happy to continue this conversation. Cindu, any last pieces of advice to our listeners just about this space?
Yeah. I think one, realize that listening to a podcast or taking a workshop isn't going to make you woke and anti-racist and inclusive. This is a lifelong journey, and there really is no finish line. This is something that I make mistakes, and you learn from your mistakes, and you have to really be willing to invest time and energy and effort into being an inclusive person throughout your life. So that's my parting advice. So good luck to you all, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Cindu. Avocado toast, selfies, a mountain of student loan debt. Gen Y is anything but traditional, and with over 75 million people, it's a population you don't want to ignore. Learn more about how to serve this unique population in our guide called Attract and Profitably Serve Millennial Clients in Your RIA. Discover 3 key ways to tap into the millennial market and 6 things that they want from their financial advisor. Visit xyplanningnetwork.com/millennials for your free copy. Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes, and finally, to find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You are not alone, and you are not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm, and that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.